Karen was alone at home when she was maliciously robbed. The thieves were in and out in moments but took more than £2,000. By the time she realized, both they and her money were long gone. All she can remember was responding to an email from what she thought was her bank, asking her to confirm her security details. That was all the invitation the criminals needed.
You can't see cybercrime, but there are ways to avoid it. At Barclays, we'll never ask you to confirm your security details by email.
It was the good war, the moral war, even the just war. In 2019, the world observed the 75th anniversary of the D-Day landings, a crucial point in World War II. But did the Allies betray some of their own values in the way they fought against a radical form of evil? I'm Andrew West. Welcome to the Religion and Ethics Report here on RN Summer, and we keep asking the big questions. World leaders gathered in Portsmouth on England's south coast last year to mark the 75th anniversary of D-Day. That was the massive Allied operation to take back Western Europe during World War II. And the Second World War is widely considered a just war to defeat the extreme ideology of Nazism. But in a controversial book, British writer Peter Hitchens says that while the Allies were indeed fighting radical evil, sometimes they used immoral methods. His book, The Phoney Victory, is especially critical of the Allies' carpet bombing of German civilians. And Peter joined me from Oxford earlier. Peter, welcome.
It's always a real pleasure to be with you.
Now, Peter, this book, The Phoney Victory, The World War II Illusion, is a controversial book. It's very compelling, it's very well written, but you don't dodge controversy. So let's establish, first of all, what you're not saying, and you are emphatically not saying that Britain should have made peace with Hitler. You are emphatically not denying the radical evil that was Nazism or the horrors that it perpetrated. So without getting into the specifics yet, what is your key argument?
The main reason for writing the book is about the present day. The use of what is frankly a mistaken understanding of World War II and how it came about is very frequent in advocacy for modern wars. Almost always when people are trying to persuade particularly democratic free countries to go to war and engage in wars of choice in recent years, the politicians who wish to do this will compare their proposed enemy with Hitler. They will attack those who are opposed to the war as appeasers and compare them with Neville Chamberlain, and they will often compare themselves with Winston Churchill or Franklin Roosevelt, or both of them at once. And this misunderstanding of war is both dangerous in terms of persuading people that often crises are far simpler and more obviously solved than they are. And secondly, in misrepresenting history, which is always bad, because if we don't understand our own memory and our own past, we will make mistakes on that basis. That's the real reason I wrote it. Initially, I wrote it because I was tired of being told that Saddam Hussein or Colonel Gaddafi or whoever it was, or Vladimir Putin now, was the modern Hitler. And then I realized not merely that these comparisons were stupid in themselves, but that they were a false representation of what happened in 1939 and 1940.
Yeah, well, they're quite manipulative references too. I mean, let us say, the rather unlamented former British Prime Minister Tony Blair, who enthusiastically sort of signed Britain up to the 2003 Iraq War. As you point out, he basically accused any of his opponents of being like Neville Chamberlain, the pre-World War II Prime Minister, of appeasement.
Yes, and the funny thing is though, that you say that Mr. Blair is now much reviled, which is true, but he's much reviled principally by the people who fell for him in a big way at the time. There was a very large amount of support for the war which he helped to engender in Iraq among people who now forget that they supported it and swallowed all the arguments. So I think that it is important, because the next time it comes around, exactly the same people who were beguiled by false arguments in 2003 will be beguiled by them again, unless they arm themselves with a proper understanding of history.
Well, not the next time it comes around. You point out that it's still happening. We have these references to Putin, certainly an authoritarian president of Russia, that's true, but we had Hillary Clinton, and even thoughtful people like the Prince of Wales make these comparisons. I don't know whether he'd thought that much about it, but comparing Putin to Hitler.
I don't think people do. And then there is this constant claim that Russia is an aggressive power in Europe. This is a country which has, in the past 30 years, given up without a fight 700,000 square miles of territory in Europe alone, and is being portrayed as an aggressor. And the complexity of this is almost impossible to explain to people, but it is to compare the position of present-day Russia with that of 1938 Germany is just so ridiculous that it's almost beyond belief.
Now, I was explicit about what the book was not, and you've got
it's kind of you to do that.
Yeah,
it saves me a lot of trouble.
well,
people will tell these lies about you if you get involved in this.
Well, and you have a section saying what the book is not. So you took a risk here, Peter. What is the risk in making the sort of arguments that you're making?
Well, the risk is there in any serious argument about anything. The moment you begin to think critically about any subject, whether it's conventional wisdom, you can expect to be misrepresented by your opponents. It's the level of debate, even in areas such as history, is very, very poor. And the temptation for your critics to dismiss you on the basis of spurious claims that you're some sort of Hitler apologist or whatever other rubbish they come up with is always there, because it saves them the trouble of having to do the job properly of both reading what you say and replying to what you say. And I haven't actually had any really serious attempts to review this book in the British press at all. It's either been defamed or it's been ignored, and people don't like to engage. And this is just a sad fact about modern intellectual discourse. It's sort of conducted at a very low level, and I deliberately built into the book quite considerable damage control barriers against these very things, so that nobody who had read the book could conceivably say the things which they would be tempted to say.
There's a very evocative description, these are your words, and very apt for our program. You say that World War II took on a, quote, pseudo-religious quality. What is the pseudo-religious quality of World War II?
It's become a sort of scripture. I think for a lot of people, certainly in my generation, this is so. The pictures in the mind of the retreat from Dunkirk, the pillar of fire by day and the pillar of cloud by night, the romantic moment of the finest hour of the view of the Battle of Britain pilots saving us from this great evil empire. The whole idolization of Winston Churchill into a figure far larger than any human being could possibly be is, again, almost scriptural. And I think for us, these stories became more powerful in our minds than such things as the parable of the Good Samaritan or the parable of the prodigal son, or many, many biblical passages, which previously, I think, would have informed people's morality much more than they do now. Now, the Second World War, particularly in the Anglosphere countries, is a sort of scripture from which people draw moral conclusions and make moral comparisons. And it's become extremely important in any argument, right down to children's games. Who's bad and who's good is defined in terms of the Second World War. And of course, the other ultimate evil of Hitler himself has led us to the point of Godwin's law, where it actually has to be stated that the first person who introduces Hitler into any argument about politics is the one who's lost it, because otherwise it would be pulled out as the trump card in every and any argument. Oh, that's what Hitler said, that's what Hitler did, so you must be wrong.
I think, though, Peter, that many listeners would surely agree that World War II, certainly compared with that wasted sacrifice, despite the millions of examples of individual bravery, but that largely wasted sacrifice of World War I, surely World War II was the good war of the two?
Well, I think that it probably makes a lot more sense to regard them as the same war. The Second World War was a continuation in many ways of all the combats and struggles and conflicts of the first. And I think what we tend to do in coming to our conclusions about the Second World War is simply closing our minds to aspects of it which would undermine its claims to be a good war. It just doesn't mean, and here I have to put in the caveat again, this doesn't mean that I think that the Hitler regime was not ultimately evil and didn't have to be defeated, because I do think both those things, it was ultimately evil, it did have to be defeated. But we have to recognize that in the conduct of that war, we allied ourselves with a power which may not have been quite as bad as the Third Reich, but was certainly comparable with it in terms of repression, violence towards its own people, and general uncivilized savagery, namely Stalin's Soviet Union. Next, we have to recognize a thing which in Britain it's almost impossible to discuss, which is that we deliberately, as a matter of policy, bombed German civilians in their homes and killed them. And thirdly, we have to look at the terrible consequences of the Potsdam Agreement and the mass expulsions and ethnic cleansing of Germans from Central Europe, which was conducted with appalling, unforgivable savagery, about which most people don't even know in the years immediately after the war. If you put these things into your understanding of it, it's much, much harder to make out that it was such a good war. It may have been a necessary war, which the First World War was not, but then again, it was made necessary by the leftover, unfinished business of the First World War. If we hadn't had the First World War, we would never have needed to have the Second.
You raise a couple of cases there that I'm going to examine in particular. This is the Religion and Ethics Report. Andrew West with you. I'm speaking with Peter Hitchens. Peter's latest book is The Phoney Victory, The World War II Illusion. A powerful book, a controversial book, but Peter doesn't shy away from that. So, Peter, how then should Britain have dealt with its two major challenges, Hitler's treatment of his own people, the German Jews and the Roma populations in particular, and his expansionist ambitions in, Austria, Czechoslovakia, I think Eastern France, and then Poland? How should Britain have dealt with those?
The first thing you have to understand is that the campaign of industrialized systematic mass murder of Jews in particular in territory under German control did not begin until after the war had begun. The policy of the German state towards Jews before the war began was extremely savage, often violent and homicidal. The worst instance, of course, being the famous Kristallnacht in 1938. Where the state-sponsored pogroms took place, synagogues were burnt to the ground, many Jews were beaten to death, again, under state sponsorship. But the actual extermination program waited until the war had begun. So we didn't have, as a reason for acting, in 1939, the Holocaust, which many people now retrospectively imagine was one of the causes for our intervention. When we did learn, and we learned this through the extraordinary courage of people who smuggled the truth out of Central Europe, when we did learn of what was actually going on, and when we were urged to act in two ways, one by making it easier for Jews to flee from Europe, and the other way by bombing the railways that led to the extermination camps, we did nothing. Our attempt to give a moral justification to war by claiming that we fought it in some way to save the Jews of Europe from mass murder is simply not true. It wasn't a motivation for starting the war, and it wasn't something we were prepared to do once the war had begun.
Yeah, well, am I right?
We shouldn't kid ourselves about this. In fact, the camps were, I won't say liberated, they were discovered and closed down, not actually by us, but by the Soviet Red Army, the army of another highly repressive power.
Am I right in recalling from my history that the worst of the industrial scale genocide actually occurred in the last year or so of the war, in that frantic period when you can do things sort of under the cover of night, metaphorically?
The German phrase, Nacht und Nebel, night and fog, was one which they used for the hiding of a lot of the most wicked things that they did. It's undoubtedly easier in wartime to hide evil on this scale. There are other more complicated arguments about this, which I honestly don't enter into in the book, about the extent to which the extermination of the Jews was actually a consequence of the war beginning. I don't make that case. Other people, Pat Buchanan, has made it. What I am saying is that we make a retroactive claim that we fought the war for this reason, but it wasn't. So we continued to have, right up until the outbreak of war in 1939, more or less normal diplomatic relations with the German state. We exchanged ambassadors. There was no attempt to break off relations because we disapproved of their internal policies. At that time, in general, I think most states tended to think the internal policies of other states were their own business, and it wasn't a reason for going to war. You have to really look at the diplomatic reasons why the war began, rather than to imagine that we did it because we disapproved of what the Nazis were doing in Germany at the time. Because actually, although we might have done on a personal basis, on a political and diplomatic basis, it wasn't part of our policy.
Let's come to what you argue in The Phoney Victory is perhaps the greatest ethical challenge for those who posit World War II as the good war. Now, the Luftwaffe bombed London, Liverpool, Coventry, I think. There was maybe 40,000 people killed in 1941. So surely when the Allies began their carpet bombing of Hamburg and later Dresden in something called Operation Gomorrah, Peter, wasn't this just a case of Germans getting their just desserts?
Oddly enough, at the beginning of the war, and this would have been the case with almost any statesman or politician in any civilized or Western country, we had a policy of not bombing civilians or populated areas. It was something that was just considered beyond the laws of civilized war, to the extent that war can be fought in a civilized way. The international law had come very close before 1939 to banning the bombing of civilian areas. It didn't quite ever get ratified, but the general view was that it was entirely wrong. And the transformation of this view in civilized countries to one of almost gung-ho delight in the bombing, deliberate bombing of civilians, is extraordinary. The Germans certainly behaved with extreme savagery, but people were infuriated and distressed by it when they saw the consequences of it, and rightly so, because it is a disgusting form of warfare to drop high explosive and incendiaries on people in their homes, which seems to me to lead to the next question. If you think it was so bad for them to do it, and if you found the application of it to us and the terrible consequences of it and the deaths, as I say, of civilians, including women and children, in their homes under bombardment from the sky, then how can you possibly justify doing it yourself? You can't, is the simple answer. Certainly not if you're conducting anything remotely resembling a Christian war or imagining that you are in any way governed as a country by Christian morality. People argued very strongly against it at the time, including the late Bishop George Bell of Chichester, who stood up in the House of Lords and said what we are doing is totally wrong and we shouldn't be doing it.
Yeah, and we should point out that Bishop George Bell, the Church of England bishop, he was not a pacifist. He didn't say there was never a case for war. He was quite selective in his criticism. I mean, selective in a good way.
He took military advice from Basil Little Hart about what he was going to say. He was very careful. And what's more, what he said in public reflected, interestingly, a secret struggle in Whitehall, which C.P. Snow wrote about in his Godkin lectures, over whether the bombing was militarily justified. By the way, you mentioned Hamburg and Dresden. I have to tell you, it was far, far more extensive than that. You need to read a book by Anthony Grayling called Among the Dead Cities, which gives a full list of all the German cities, dozens and dozens and dozens of them, cities you've never heard of in many cases, which were plastered with high explosive and incendiaries, often without any attempt to justify their destruction as military targets, because they weren't.
Let's stick with the morality of it, because one thing that I really learned from your book was that many of the cities, particularly Hamburg, that were carpet bombed, had in fact been the sort of last holdouts inside Germany against the Nazis. So in many respects, the Allies were bombing the people who were resistors as much as they could have been in Nazi Germany.
That is true. I was recently in the lovely old Hanseatic town of Lübeck, or what's left of it, which was selected deliberately as a target because it contained so many beautiful old wooden medieval buildings, and they wanted to see how well it would burn. And Lübeck had been so opposed to Hitler, it refused to let him visit in the days when he was still campaigning rather than actually became Chancellor. It had been a centre of opposition. Hamburg, again, very much a social democratic and pro-British city. But of course, the other point about area bombing was that to be effective, it had to be concentrated on densely populated working-class areas. It was no good bombing middle-class suburbs because the houses were too far apart. A lot of the explosives were wasted and the fires didn't spread. So the people who were bombed were more or less those who had been the last ones to continue to vote Social Democrat against Hitler, which many people very bravely did, even after it was clear that Hitler was in power. And these were the people who we were bombing. You can argue all kinds of things about German civilians, though I often wonder whether those who say, that they supported Hitler or they didn't resist him, how they would have behaved under such a regime with the Gestapo in their towns. I wonder how brave they would have been themselves. But you simply cannot argue that small children and babies, who are inevitably in quite large numbers the victims of these attacks, can possibly be made responsible for the actions of the regime under which they lived.
On the Religion and Ethics Report with Andrew West, I'm speaking with Peter Hitchens about Peter's newest book, The Phoney Victory, The World War II Illusion. In spite of all your criticism of the Hamburg and Dresden bombings in particular, you are very definite here that you reject any moral equivalence between the air raids and the Holocaust. You say, look, don't fall into that trap. So how could the Allies have won over the Nazis without these bombing runs?
Well, this is a very interesting question. Undoubtedly the case that the military effect of the bombing was not decisive, and arguments made for it that it saved us from invasion, for instance, are false, because by the time the bombing really got underway, the Battle of Stalingrad had already happened, and there was no realistic threat that the Germans would turn westwards again. They were losing in the east. The only argument that is serious that can be made in favour of the bombing is that it diverted a large number of fighter aircraft from the Eastern Front. But this would also have been true of properly targeted daylight bombing of real military and industrial targets. On the rare occasions when it was attempted, was very successful, which would have diverted the fighters in the same way without being both wasteful and immoral. So it did not turn the scale of the war. The war in Europe was won, I have to say, and we really do need to admit this, was won by the Soviet armies and not by our bombing, which was almost a token to, in many cases, put forward by Churchill to appease Stalin when he complained, as he unceasingly did, about the refusal of the Allies to open a second front in Western Europe until very late in the war. That was one of the reasons for it.
Now, one area where, again, you don't claim any moral equivalence, but you do come somewhat closer here, is the treatment of the ethnic German populations in Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary, I think perhaps France as well, in the immediate aftermath of the war. What was the stated intention for those populations, stated at the Potsdam Conference in 1945 when the Allied leadership met?
Well, the stated intention was that the ethnic Germans were to be removed from these countries by what was called an orderly and humane process. And those who said this knew when they said it that it was a lie, because there had been previous such transfers of population, notably after the Greco-Turkish War in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. And it's not orderly and it's not humane. It never is. It certainly wasn't. I can only commend people to read the passages in my book about this and the excellent and horrifying book upon which they're based.
Yeah, well, I'm going to read a passage.
Has that title, Orderly and Humane.
We're talking here about 12 to 14 million people who were transferred. Is that right?
I think that's about right. No one really knows.
What was the death toll of those post-war transfers of ethnic Germans?
No one really knows.
But you've got an estimate
of guesswork, yeah,
of up to 1.5 million.
Yeah, this is perfectly possible. The horrors of it were really very extensive indeed. The really astonishing thing about it is this huge event took place, and people don't even know it happened.
Well, here's one section, very powerful section of your book that I want to read. You've deliberately used blanks to let people guess or to give them a sense of what they might be thinking about. In a single incident, 265 blank, including 120 women and 74 children, were killed on June 18 by blank troops who removed them from a train at Horn Mostenice near Prerov, shot them in the back of the neck and buried them in a mass grave that they had been forced to dig beside the railway station. What is that a description of? Because I know what people might think it's a description of.
Well, it's a description of the massacre of German civilians by Czech troops. So it still makes me shudder to say it, because it's so unexpected as a fact, but it is. That's what it is.
It could be a description of German behaviour during the Holocaust.
Very much so.
So if you say the killing was not revenge attacks for what had been witnessed in the Holocaust, how does that killing come about, the type that I've just described?
I think that there is just a terrible thing. The human capacity for good and evil is enormous, and certain things once unleashed have an almost limitless effect. And I think when you unleash ethnic cleansing, and when you have state backing for it, as was the case in this, people will behave in the most atrocious ways. And we see it again and again. And it's a warning against anybody who ever suggests that this is a sensible policy, that the transfer of population, it sounds so mathematical and clean. It never Never is. It is one of the great catastrophes of modern times. It's a deep shame. And to this day, people keep very quiet about it. And also, to this day, disreputable people in Germany who ought not to speak as they do make false equivalences about it. There it is. It is there. And in any assessment of the goodness or otherwise of the Second World War, it has to form part of the calculation.
I mean, the moral point that you seem to argue is that it's not about comparing these post-war Allied crimes with the horrific crimes of the Nazis, but you have to judge these post-war crimes by the Allies in themselves.
You do, and the fact that somebody else did something, it's so terrible that it can barely be spoken of without despair, does not mean that there is no remaining calculus on which other evils can be judged to be bad. You can't say, because the worst thing in the world happened, that all other moral judgments about your own actions are suspended. And what you must avoid absolutely is two things. One, the claim that these actions made us no better than the Nazis, which isn't true. And the other, the claim that the Nazi actions were so bad that what we did afterwards can be excused or forgotten, which is also not true. There is a point between those which is harder to bear, and this is the problem. Both of those things are easy conclusions for glib people to jump to. The point in between where I am is much harder to bear, much harder to live with, and makes judgments about the present and the future much harder to make. Well, that's a good thing. We should be more careful. Ever since the first time I saw what a human head looks like after a bullet has passed through it, ever since then, I think I've been much more cautious about war. The purpose of history is, I think, to let people know what the consequences of present actions can and will be, and we should pay more attention to it.
In the end, Peter, I think of a parallel between World War II and the American Civil War, and I remember that very compelling Ken Burns documentary series on the American Civil War. And I recall a historian, though, who said, look, the Civil War never started as a war to end the monstrosity or, the heresy that was slavery. But Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation during that war ultimately did elevate the Civil War morally. Couldn't we say the same thing about World War II, that despite all of the other agendas, Britain trying to hold on to its place as an imperial country and territorial disputes in Europe, couldn't we ultimately say, though, that World War II put our foot on the throat of the most radical evil of our time, and in that sense we can justify it?
Well, yes, I think you can say that, but having once said that, that doesn't prevent you from saying, did we fight it in the right way at the right time? Could we have fought it differently? Could we have fought it more morally and done fewer bad things on our own part in the course of defeating that evil? And I think the answers to all those questions are probably yes. And I think that consideration is the one I would like people to come away with. I think that the war ultimately had to be fought at some point. But look, here is the most startling thing. Britain in 1939 was not a trivial or a weak or a poor country, and nor was France. These were two very considerable powers, not great powers by the standards of the superpowers of today, but two very considerable powers. And they started a war at the wrong moment, on the wrong issue, which they, in France's case, they lost and were then subjected to the most appalling subjugation, during which they were compelled, for instance, to hand over French Jews to be murdered by the Germans, a shame on France, which it will never, as far as I'm concerned, expiate. And Britain came within inches of being in the same position. Now, that's not competent diplomacy. The whole thing only needed to shift a few inches to the left or the right, and we would have been cooperating with Germany in the twilight of Europe. It was a very close run thing. Why did we take this risk? And we didn't need to. And I think that this is the most serious point in my book, that an awful lot of the reason why we dashed into an ill-timed, ill-prepared war, which we very nearly lost, was national vanity.
Peter, thank you as always for giving us a lot to think about.
Well, thank you very much for having me on.
And that's the Religion and Ethics Report for today. For these stories and more, subscribe to us at the ABC Listen app or iTunes. Thanks to Mudra Tadias and Jennifer Parsonage. I'm Andrew West. See you soon.